So in this video, I'm going to take a look at a couple of other aspects of context, particularly the literary context of a text that you are going to be exegeting. So I'm just going to focus right now on two criticisms. One is known as source criticism, and the other one is redaction criticism. So we'll begin here, first of all, with understanding source criticism. So the methodology here attempts to identify the sources, whether it's written or oral, that are going to be used by the author to construct their text. So in other words, this is imagining that authors have access to material as they are constructing their text. And so sometimes this material could be in the form of text, written text, or they may be recalling, as it were, things that they have heard and utilizing that. So here are some examples. In the Old Testament, many people recognize or acknowledge the idea of JEPD. These letters stand for different sources that were available to the author of the Pentateuch that they used to construct different portions of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So the J stands for Yahweh, Jehovah, and so this is material that comes from a Yahwehist. In other words, they use the term Yahweh when referring to God. The E refers to the word Elohim, which is kind of the generic word for God or gods, but oftentimes this is the way in which that author or that source refers to God. So sometimes you'll have God referred to as Yahweh, which in English is sometimes indicated by all capitalized letters, the LORD. And then in other places, it'll just have the word God. And so that's reflecting the use of the word Elohim or El. The P stands for priestly material. So a source that really focused in on the temple and cultic rites. And the D stands for deuteromistic. In other words, this is a source that really focuses in on the covenant and Israel's relationship to the covenant and obedience to the covenant. There are also probably non-Israelite sources that different authors have access to and might utilize, particularly like say in the Proverbs. There are Proverbs that look like they have their origin from other places, maybe within Egyptian wisdom materials that the author is using as they construct that text. So in the New Testament, we have particularly with the Gospels, you'll have what we call the synoptic problem, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have shared material, and of course they, what's the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke in terms of the sources that they use. The general consensus or theory is that Mark's gospel was written first, that Matthew and Luke would have access to Mark, and then as well other unique sources. We have Q here. This is a theoretical document, whether it was written or in oral form. So there is material that Matthew and Luke share together. And the question is what was the nature of that source and how did they utilize that source? And so, plus there could also be oral sources, material. So think about Luke, and Luke talks about talking to eyewitnesses, and then has like speeches in the book of Acts. Well, where do these speeches come from? Who told Luke this information? And so those could be in oral sources. So that's a source criticism type question. So I've talked about Acts here, eyewitnesses accounts. So those would be like that. So oral sources could also be utilized in the Gospels itself. The other thing I'll just point out here quickly to you is redaction criticism. So redaction criticism is looking at the methodology to identify how an author redacted or edited their sources. Now, particularly this good example will be the synoptic authors. So if the theory is correct that Mark is written first, Matthew and Luke have access to some kind of mark, whether it's the mark that we currently have or an earlier version of Mark, then when we see this material showing up in Matthew and Luke, how have they edited that information? Because while there's a lot of close proximity to it, there's also changes. And so Matthew and Luke may have decided that there's needed to be things added or left out in their Mark account so that it was be clearer to their audience. Um, so this criticism presupposes that authors are not simply collectors. So what we have in this is just not them gathering the sources, but that they are engaged with making sure those sources are now understandable potentially to a different audience. So the sources may have been written for one kind of audience, and then our biblical authors are writing for a different audience. And so sometimes in order to help this new audience to appreciate or understand that this source. So we're seeing them as editors, or some might consider creative theologians. In other words, they are helping to create these texts in ways that expresses theological ideas more clearly. In the Old Testament, some examples of redaction criticism that often shows up is the Chronicles, and how it may be using the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and how it may be editing it. So there may be a position towards the Davidic kingship, in particular, that books of Samuel and Kings have, as opposed to the way in which the author of Chronicles see Davidic kingship. So I've already mentioned synoptic authors and how they might be treating it. So we have an example in 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul recalls a tradition that received from him. So the source is oral, and has Paul edited that source, what was told to him in the tradition, in such a way that it fits the purpose of what he's trying to communicate in 1 Corinthians 15. In 2 Corinthians 6, verses 16 through 18, we see Paul making use of what looks like literary sources, biblical sources, Old Testament texts, and how is he editing those texts. So it's not just about quoting Scripture, but also how Scripture is quoted and utilized and being basically interpreted by the author for their audience. So I just wanted to highlight these two particular criticisms. We've been looking at both the historical, cultural context, but when we think about context, we're also thinking about its literary context. So how does this text fit, the text that you're exegeting, how does it fit within the piece of literature that it's found? In other words, the book in which it is found. So thanks.